About 6 months ago, at the end of February, Russia invaded Ukraine in an attempt to annex several more parts of the country after years ago annexing Crimea. This now 6+ month invasion and war in Eastern Europe has caused a number of ripple effects in the international community, especially on the economic side, where in the weeks following the initial invasion of Ukraine, several nations across the world, including us here in the United States, imposed significant sanctions on both Vladimir Putin, the president of Russia, as well as other oligarchs and the economy proper in Russia. Here join us now on the Megacast to talk about how those sanctions back then and continued sanctions are impacting the Russian economy and that impact it has down the line for the world economy, including here in the U.S., is Michael Greiner from Oakland University School of Business Administration. Michael, thanks for joining us today.
Great to be here again. Thanks, Tyler.
Yeah, glad to have you on. This is a really interesting topic because we heard so much about these sanctions being imposed on Russia and the crippling effect that they were going to have on the Russian economy months ago when they were first imposed and the weeks following the initial invasion at the beginning of Russia's unjust war with Ukraine. That being said, now here we are 6-7 months later, following both that invasion and the sanctions that came after it. And we are seeing that the effects of those sanctions on the Russian economy are having some effects on the world economy, including here in the U.S. Give us a brief summary to begin on what some of those lasting effects have been months later, nearly over half a year since those sanctions were imposed.
Sure. Well, maybe what I'd like to do, if I could, is start with talking about the impact on Russia, because if anything, Russia's done a really good job of kind of spinning the whole economic situation. There's a report that recently came out from Yale University, and I'm really actually proud of my colleagues for going through this process, where they kind of looked at what Russia was claiming and then wanted to analyze to see the extent to which it was true. Now, Russia has pointed very proudly at the fact that they've been able to essentially sustain the value of the ruble. So rather than it dropping down to 1 cent, it's now valued at 2 cents per ruble. So not exactly like it's an extremely powerful currency, but nevertheless, it's higher than it was when the invasion first happened. And they're very proud of this fact. But that's within the context of the fact that right now, you basically can't trade in rubles. There is no global market for rubles at this point. If you were to be in Russia and you had dollars and you wanted to exchange them for rubles, you could do that easily. On the other hand, if you had rubles and wanted to buy dollars, you would be unable to do that pretty much anywhere in the world at this point. At this point, also defaulted on its foreign debt. This is the first time that they've done so since the Russian Revolution back in 1917. About 1,000 companies, foreign companies, have left Russia, and that accounts for about 40% of Russia's GDP. So we're talking very substantial impact here. Now, inflation has been very high in Russia as a result. Apparently, unemployment is high in Russia. But hey, they've got that ruble still holding up. So they keep pointing that and say, oh, everything's fine. The thing that has been sustaining them, if anything, has been oil, the price of oil. And that's really been the big impact that I think we've seen globally, which is the fact that the price of oil has gone up, as all of us have experienced. It's gone down now for the last couple of months, but obviously starting from the moment the war happened, for the next few months, and even now, it's still higher than it was before the war started. And that's because, of course, Russia is a major supplier of oil and gas. And as a result of that, although we here in the United States aren't necessarily large purchasers of oil and gas from Russia, the prices for those things are set on the global stage. There's a global market for these things. And so less oil and gas coming out of Russia means that the prices are going to go up. It's simple supply and demand. You have less supply, you have higher demand, prices are going to go up. So that's kind of what's been happening there. And that's really been the biggest impact that you've seen. Now, for us here in the United States, it's been, annoying, perhaps. And as I say, the prices dropped down a little bit of oil. We are major suppliers ourselves of both oil and natural gas, and we supply most of our own natural gas anyway. So we really aren't so reliant on Russia. The place this is really hurting, frankly, is in Europe. Where Russia has been very aggressive in essentially turning off the pipes coming into Europe from Russia that deliver the natural gas there. And this has been a big problem for the Europeans, who, at the beginning of this war, were importing almost 40% of their natural gas from Europe. And I'm sorry, from Russia. And that's particularly true, by the way, in Germany, which I think was importing 55% of its natural gas from Russia, which is really a shockingly large amount. Well, ever since the invasion happened, Putin, of course, has been playing games with natural gas, and recently he basically turned off the supply coming in through the largest gas pipeline from Russia into Europe, the Nord Stream pipeline. And as a result, the Europeans have been hurt by it, and prices have gone up. But what they've been doing really since the invasion happened is that they've worked very hard to supply new sources of gas, and they've been running all over, essentially signing new contracts, developing new sources of supply. And as a result, where at one point Europe was importing about 40% of its natural gas from Russia, now they're importing only about 10%. And so it appears that the Europeans are doing a pretty good job of managing this crisis and making sure that they're going to have sufficient supplies to get them through the winter, which is, of course, the big concern.
Yeah, and for the U.S., that comes into play because some of our most significant allies are some of those European countries. You think about Germany, you think about other countries in neighboring areas that are affected by really the collective European economy. And so for the United States, their course of action is, well, how do we then, if we're not so significantly affected by that, prevent some of our greatest allies from having significant economic turmoil as a result of their now more tumultuous relationship with Russia, although that was already the case. So in the US, we may not be seeing some of those more direct effects like we were in the initial months of the war in Ukraine, particularly at the gas pump. But how could those relations with our international partners in Europe that are affected by this ultimately affect our economy as our leaders play the game of balance between protecting our allies but not significantly affecting an already imbalanced, let's say, economic situation here in the U.S.?
Well, that's a great question. And the United States is basically committed that we're going to do everything we can to help Europe get through this crisis, as you would imagine. And the problem there, and this is kind of goes both ways here, is that unlike oil, natural gas is most easily shipped through pipelines. It is possible to be shipped through tankers, what they call liquefied natural gas or LNG tankers. But that requires a special kind of terminal to be able to both ship it and to receive it. And there are limited numbers of those terminals around the world, particularly in Europe, because of the fact that, again, they've been relying upon gas coming through these natural gas pipelines from Russia. So they haven't really seen the need to build as many of them. Well, as it turns out now, they've been scrambling. Actually, Germany, if you can believe it, has secured the use of a couple of floating LNG terminals that they're able to use to be able to import liquefied natural gas from the United States and from other parts of the world into Germany. So that's one more way that they've been dealing with it. But this knife kind of cuts both ways too, because at the same time as Russia has these pipelines into Europe and they're able to cut off the supply to Europe, they say, oh, we don't care if Russia cuts us off because we'll just sell our supplies elsewhere. Well, the problem is they don't have pipelines going into India or China, and these countries don't have the liquefied natural gas terminals to receive it. And for that matter, Russia doesn't have the liquefied natural gas terminals to be able to ship it. So it's not like they can just kind of pivot their sales of natural gas from Europe over to Asia the way they are able to do with oil. Now, part of the reason that Russia is so angry about this, of course, is that the United States has been leading an effort under Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen to impose what's called a price cap on Russian oil. And this initially was met by some skepticism by our European allies. But as it turns out, they've actually come around to this idea. And this is, to me, this is a great idea because it addresses a couple problems that we have at once. Number one, it's going to make sure that the price of oil doesn't rise too much by essentially not allowing Russia to benefit from the global increase in oil, and basically saying we're not going to pay any more than this amount for Russian oil, and that's it. And as a result of that, that's going to essentially put a cap on how much they're able to charge for gas. So that benefits us as the consumers. It also hurts Russia because of the fact that they aren't able to essentially make this windfall off of the oil that they're supplying to the rest of the world. Now, as it turns out, unlike in the Middle East, where they're able to drill oil very cheaply, drilling oil in Russia is actually quite expensive. So if the price cap is lowered to a certain level, then Russia will be in a position where they're really not making very much money off of selling oil. So you might say, oh, well, how are you going to enforce that? Well, as it turns out, in the West, we have the ability to enforce that because the ships that carry the oil from one country to the next are insured by insurance companies based here in the West. And so we're able to say to those insurance companies, hey, you cannot insure ships if they are carrying Russian oil that's priced above a certain level. And so that appears to be the enforcement mechanism. And then Russia says, oh, well, we'll just ship it to China and India. Well, as it turns out, China and India, they're already buying Russian gas at a huge discount because they're like, hey, if you're so desperate to sell it to us, we're going to pay less money for it. So as a result, it's really wreaked havoc on Russia's ability to gain so much money from the oil that they've been able to sell. But I think that this gas cap, this oil price cap, could potentially be the biggest tool that we in the West are using, both to kind of keep our allies together, to be able to keep the oil prices in check, while also to be able to essentially control the amount of money that Russia's able to make off of this crisis they've created.
We're joined by Michael Greiner from Oakland University School of Business Administration on today's edition of the Megacast. More information on their programs in the School of Business Administration can be found at oakland.edu. That's oakland.edu for more information. Michael, a couple more minutes with you today. Before we let you go, just overall, how will this continued situation, especially these price caps, ultimately come back and affect our economy here in the U.S.? And in particular, how could it affect consumers here in the state of Michigan?
Well, the big question, I think you're right. The global economy at this point is very integrated. So when there are problems in Europe, it's going to affect us here in the United States. I mean, some of our largest trading partners are in Europe. Similarly, the problems that China is going through right now are going to affect our economy as well. So we're integrated in the entire world. I think, frankly, the United States is very well positioned to deal with this crisis because of the fact that we are a major supplier of energy here in the world. We are able to essentially supply our own energy needs here. Is it possible that we could see an increase in gas prices and other energy prices going forward? I think that's probably likely as we go through the winter. But I don't think we'll see anything like what we're seeing in Europe. And in fact, in Europe, they're talking about imposing essentially a cap on the price of gas. And basically what they're going to do is that they're going to tax the gas companies, the energy companies, what's called a windfall tax for the extra money that they're making, and use that money essentially to subsidize consumers who are buying gas so that they're able to get through the winter without basically being bankrupted by higher energy costs, because that's really the crisis here. It comes down to a supply and demand situation. Supply is down, demand is higher in the winter, obviously, as people need to heat their homes, and there's a higher call for electricity. And as a result of that, there's certainly a potential for prices to go up. And I think that's the biggest area where we could see it here in the United States. But again, I think that the impact on us is going to be relatively limited compared to what we're going to see in Europe. And that has really geopolitical implications, though, because for this economic war against Russia to succeed, we really need our alliance to stick together. And it's going to become very hard for the Europeans as they go through this winter to stick together as they're dealing with really some hardship as a result of these shortages that they're going to be dealing with gas. And And as a result of that, I think that there's going to be a real effort on the part of the United States to try to really support our European allies and make sure that they're able to get through this winter. Because if they are, I think that Russia is really going to find itself in a position that it really has very few options left in its war.
It'll be interesting to see how this continues to develop, those relations in particular between Russia and their immediate neighbors in Eastern Europe and in Western Europe as well, and how that affects our economy here in the U.S. and in particular in Michigan. Michael, thanks for joining us.
Happy to be here. Thanks for having me.